We are.
We are.
We are. We are.
We are. Lofi Poli Sci. Yes, we are. Lofi Poli Sci podcast coming at you. Michael Pickering here with our famous question. What's going on in the world today? But today, we're kicking it with a top 10 list. The first of a 9-episode top 10 series that's going to span the next 2 months. We're calling it Our World in Numbers. We're going to be looking at top 10 countries in GDP, GDP per capita, HDI, aka the Human Development Index, and the Gini Index, looking at income inequality. Then we're doing the 10 countries with the lowest number by these scales. And we'll cap off this series with an episode talking about the state of the world in numbers, and really dive into how humanity is doing and developing. But let's slow our roll, because that's a mighty big conversation to have. First, we need to set the stage, check the map, and check ourselves all along the way. You see, having these discussions about economic development indicators isn't as easy as just seeing who's got the highest or the lowest. There's so much more than that. So for our first one today, we're doing the top 10 countries by GDP in 2021. But what is GDP, aka Gross Domestic Product? Well, firstly, it's a term or a phrase that we find gets tossed around a lot, but so few of us really understand what it means. But not anymore. Let's get our nerd on. So you can look up any definition of gross domestic product, hereafter just GDP, but all the definitions are basically the same. The total market value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a given period of time, usually a calendar of year. Great. So what does that mean? You see, when people use the statistic GDP, they regularly are using it to talk about how big a country's economy is, the size of the country's economy. You know, if someone were to ask, how big of an economy does such and such a country have? You'd answer that question in GDP, which is measured in United States dollars, and the higher the dollar amount that you tell them, it means the bigger the economy of the country is. Because you see, that dollar amount you give is actually the total value of all goods and services that the country produced in a year. So all the cars made in a year have dollar amounts associated with them. All the Uber trips in a year have a dollar amount associated with them. All the everything in a country has a dollar amount associated with it. And if you add up all the values of all those final goods and services produced within a country in a given year, that's a country's GDP, aka gross domestic product, for that year. And it's how we measure the size of every country's economy, and we use it to compare to other countries as well as to the previous year to see how much growth the economy has gone through. All kinds of stuff. But that's all GDP is. The monetary value of everything produced in a country in one calendar year. Now you know. And it's regularly measured in US dollars because that currency is used for more business transactions across the planet than any other currency. But enough of all that nerd talk. Let's get to the list already. Top 10 countries by GDP in the calendar year of 2021. And our data come from the IMF, aka the International Monetary Fund. And coming in at number 10, South Korea at $1.8 trillion in 2021. Number 9, Canada at $2 trillion in 2021. Number 8, Italy at $2.1 trillion. Number 7, France at $2.94 trillion. Number 6, India at $2.946 trillion, just edging out France in 2021. Now to our top 5. And number 5, the United Kingdom at $3.1 trillion. Number 4, Germany at $4.2 trillion. Number 3, Japan at $5.1 trillion. Number 2, China at $16.8 trillion in 2021. And number 1, the U.S. at $22.9 trillion. But now, let's dig a little deeper to see what we can really get just from looking at our list. Let's see what the data tell us. Firstly, if it wasn't apparent from listening to the list, let me go ahead and tell you. This list is so geographically biased it isn't even funny. 6 countries in the list are all Western countries in Europe and North America: US, Germany, UK, France, Italy, Canada. The 4 remaining countries are Asian countries: China, India, South Korea, and Japan. So where's Latin America and Africa at? We'll get to that at a later date for sure. Secondly, and taking a quick look at 2020's GDP rankings, our list this year is the exact same countries in the exact same order as last year, meaning all the top 10 economies in the world grew together in 2021 in comparison to 2020, and no country overtook another country in their list placement. Thirdly, China is sitting at number 2. The next closest to it is Japan, and there's a gap between number 2 and number 3 on this list by over $11 trillion. If Japan doubles its GDP, it would still be behind China at number 3. It's a massive, massive gap between our second and third largest GDP countries. And that gap goes up to $17 trillion from our number 1 to number 3. Meaning, China and the United States economies are far, far larger than any other countries in the world. And even the gap between number 1 and number 2 is pretty massive, at about $6.1 trillion. I mean, to put that in perspective, the gap between our number 1 and our number 2 is a dollar amount larger than our number 3 country. The gap is $6.1 trillion between number 1 and number 2, and our number 3 is Japan at $5.1 trillion. And if you add up numbers 3 through 10, you get a total of $24.1 trillion, which is just $2 trillion over the United States. Now, if you add the US and China together, you get $39.7 trillion. Compared to the rest of the list combined at $24.1 trillion, and the gap between our top 2 and the entire rest of the list is $15.6 trillion. But why? We must ask. Is the US and China outpacing the rest of the world and even the other top countries in the world by so much? And it's really a rather simple answer that few people ever talk about. And really, it's all in the definition of what is GDP. You see, GDP is the value of all goods and services produced in a country. Okay, cool. We know, we got that. But where do those goods and services come from? And our answer is people. People make goods, and people provide services. And the more people you have, the more potential goods and services your country can produce. China and the US have 2 of the largest populations in the world, meaning their potential economic output is far greater than countries with smaller populations. And it really is as simple as that. It's also why India is on the up and up in GDP rankings the past decade. All the countries on this list have good-sized populations and are heavily industrialized or industrializing and continuing to develop their economies at a great pace. But we should also make a note, because as we see so many European countries on this list, you may be asking, what about the European Union? Aren't they a single market economy or something like that? And in fact, they are. And in 2021, their estimated GDP was about $17 trillion, meaning they would end up as number 2 on this list and outperform China. However, our list is a list of countries, so the EU isn't on it. But to the fact about outpacing China, well, that's for the moment. China and the EU are very, very close in GDP, and China will likely overtake them soon enough. And to that end, China's going to overtake the US inevitably as well. China has an enormous population, even in comparison to the US. It dwarfs the US population. And as more and more sectors of the Chinese economy grow, their economic potential, measured in human capabilities, is of course greater than that of the US, because China has more people. Shout out to India, same thing applies. Now, to that remark in particular, some of you who know a little bit about India's economy, their level of development, and their level of poverty in the country, you may be asking, if India still has a major problem with poverty, how can they be so high on this list? At number 6, highest GDP in the world. Does that make it look like India is more developed than they really are? Question mark. And that, my friends, goes into the very heart of the question we ask with every list we do. Does this list really matter? And the short answer is no, not by itself at least, and not in a conversation about greater economic development and human development around the world. GDP is just one of many variables we have to look at in order to get a good idea of what's going on in a country. You know, the story with India is complex. It has the 6th highest GDP in the world and a serious poverty problem. It's almost as if we need something that would, I don't know, take into account the size of the country's population and maybe the amount of income inequality in the country. Spoiler alert, we'll be doing GDP per capita and Gini index really soon, as well as the Human Development Index, because you truly can't capture the progress of a people, of a country, just by looking at a dollar amount, just by looking at dollar signs. Money isn't everything. So stay tuned for the next part in our 9-episode segment, Our World in Numbers. And that's this Tuesday's Top 10 list. Check out this month's issue of Letters of the Lofi Poli Sci, where our theme was, They Can't Stop the Signal. Always remember that Lofi Poli Sci is more than just me. It's the we that we be. Talk to you soon, Lofi listeners. Pickering, signing off. A little behind the scenes for all you listeners that stuck around. I actually wanted to use World Bank data for today, but the World Bank hasn't come out with 2021 GDPs yet. Very interesting. So we had to use IMF. Now you know.